Hi, and welcome to Data and Donuts. I'm Mara Sedlins, the Data Management Specialist at Morgan Library. For this workshop, I'm going to talk about some strategies and tools for doing better collaborative research. Here's the plan for today. I'm going to start by talking about some of the benefits and challenges of collaborative research, describe some general principles of good collaboration, and then give you an overview of some of the different collaboration tools available. I'll end with an exercise using the Open Science Framework, which is a tool I think is particularly valuable. There are many different types of collaborations, and I'd like to start just by describing a few examples. The first is a collaborative research project I heard about through one of the other researchers who was in my data curation postdoctoral program. Her background is in medieval history, but she's been involved in a project at the University of Nottingham that combines the expertise of early medieval historians and molecular biologists to test the effectiveness of medieval remedies for killing modern-day drug-resistant bacteria. They've found remarkable success with a 1,000-year-old remedy for eye infections known as Bald's eye salve. This research now involves an international team consisting of microbiologists, medievalists, parasitologists, wound specialists, and pharmacists. Here's another example that's closer to home. There are a number of collaborative research projects at CSU, but here's one that was featured in The Source in 2016. A new piece of software was developed to help farmers, ranchers, and other agricultural producers better understand the environmental impact of their work. The software, called the Ecosystem Services and Farm Management Optimization Tool, was developed by a PhD student in soil and crop sciences with the help of 2 students from the computer science program and 1 from the Department of Forest and Rangeland Stewardship. The lead student on the project is quoted as saying that this work is a great example of multidisciplinary collaborations and efforts of applying what students learned in school with practical concepts to create useful applications. Other examples of collaborative research would be a traditional research lab, collaborations between grad students and their advisors, and even reusing other researchers' data in a secondary analysis. The Research Parasite Award was first suggested as a joke on Twitter, but now it honors researchers who make outstanding contributions using other people's data, which have been made available for that purpose. As illustrated by these examples, research collaborations can be quite diverse. They can be multidisciplinary, multi-institutional, or multi-sector, and they can involve faculty and students at different levels of expertise and experience, as well as partners in the community, government, or private corporations. Collaborations can also proceed in different ways. Research partners may collect data together but focus on different research questions and analyses, or compile data from different sources and publish together. Collaborators may also divide up the work based on differing skills and expertise, or they might work together at each step of the project. Other, less traditional types of collaborations might involve sharing tangible materials like biological specimens, access to special equipment, or receiving training in a new technique or method. Collaborations between academic researchers and private companies can involve special challenges around questions of intellectual property, such as proprietary information or trade secrets. Researchers may need to sign a contract or data use agreement limiting the ways that they can use privately owned data. And finally, certain types of collaborations, like clinical trials, may have a more formalized set of criteria and procedures. So, what are some of the benefits to engaging in collaborative research? There are a lot of reasons. This cartoon illustrates a big one: avoid duplicating others' work. The benefits of interdisciplinary collaborations in particular have received a lot of attention in recent years. Complex problems like climate change and public health require the combined expertise of people working in multiple fields. Since the 1970s, interdisciplinary science has been on the rise in terms of publications that cite research from multiple disciplines, interdisciplinary research centers, and funding opportunities. CSU supports interdisciplinary research with research centers like the Institute for Research in the Social Sciences, the Center for Healthy Aging, the Center for Fair and Alternative Trade, and the Research Innovation Center on the Foothills campus that provides a hub for university scientists and students to partner with businesses. And I'm sure there are others that I'm not aware of yet. In general, collaboration has the potential for many advantages. Working with other researchers can expand the potential audience for your research, provide more perspectives on a problem, make the process of research more efficient by dividing the labor according to individual expertise, and grant access to greater collective resources, such as funding, the ability to collect more data, access to specialized materials or facilities, or geographic features or populations. Collaboration also holds researchers more accountable to follow rigorous practices in their methods and analysis, creates mentorship opportunities, and builds relationships that can lead to ongoing collaborations in the future. However, collaborative research can also face a number of challenges. When it comes to interdisciplinary work, a common issue is learning to use a common vocabulary and communicating without discipline-specific jargon. Different fields also have different epistemological and methodological approaches, which can be complementary to one another, but can also create conflict about what direction the research should take or what should be prioritized. Even if a collaboration is between researchers in the same discipline, if they're coming from different labs, they will likely have their own different ways of operating, and in order to work together, they will need to be intentional about coordinating with each other. Relatedly, collaboration partners may have different expectations or assumptions about a project that can create conflict if they aren't identified early. For example, it's important to be transparent about who will be an author on papers that emerge from the collaboration, as well as expected order of authorship, since this is usually very important to researchers for their career advancement. If the research produces new inventions or other patentable discoveries, then an intellectual property agreement will need to be negotiated. When it comes to data produced by the research, intellectual property is usually less relevant than data ownership or access. At most academic institutions, data produced by the research is owned by the university, but for a cross-institutional collaboration, this may become less clear. And, as I mentioned earlier, collaborations involving an industry partner may present additional restrictions on intellectual property and data access. There can also be disparities in influence or resources across collaborators, institutions, or disciplines that need to be negotiated. And although ideally collaboration makes research more efficient, there is also the potential for it to take more time to produce tangible outcomes, especially for interdisciplinary research. Many of these challenges can be effectively addressed by some of the same approaches that have been recommended in recent years for improving research reproducibility. I mentioned earlier that sharing your data for reuse by other researchers, as illustrated by the Research Parasite Awards, can be thought of as a form of collaboration. You could also think of your future self as a collaborator. There is a sense in which your future self is like a stranger in that you won't necessarily remember the details of what you're working on right now after several years, or maybe even several months. Making your research reproducible by sharing data with appropriate documentation and code is a way of promoting good collaboration, both in the traditional sense and with people you don't know. Next, I'm going to talk about some of the principles of good collaborative research, which also draw on best practices for research reproducibility. One of the most important aspects of collaboration is communication. One way that teams communicate is through documentation. Documentation is key for both reproducibility and collaboration. It can explicitly outline procedures and protocols, make sure everyone is on the same page concerning terminology, describe roles and responsibilities, as well as include plans and timelines for the overall project. You'll also want to think about and determine a mode of communication and a plan for file sharing. These decisions really focus on the how of implementing a collaborative project. Are you going to have phone calls, meet in person, use Skype or Google Hangout? Also, where are you going to keep all the files you produce in a project so everyone can access them and you aren't stuck sending files over email? If folks will be working on the same files, then it's also important to come up with a plan or program to use for version control. Developing this plan is also an iterative process, so if possible, it's important to meet regularly to check in with each other. And because collaborations are built on relationships, then meeting in person is also really valuable when possible. Now I'm going to go over a few examples of types of documentation that may be produced during a project. First is an operational policy document that would be produced at the very beginning of a project. This document could include what the role of each party is and how your objectives will accomplish the goals of the project, information on how to train individuals, communication plans between the different groups, being clear about how any problems that arise will be handled, confidentiality and privacy issues, and how any patents or intellectual property rights will be handled, and then having a clear timeline for each group's contributions. What information is covered in these types of operational plans can vary across groups, but going through the process of actually creating these types of documents will make sure everyone is on the same page from the beginning of a project. Another form of documentation that might be required during a collaborative project are formal legal agreements. These are agreements that are vetted and formally approved by institutions and often cover aspects of the allocation of funds, intellectual property rights, how data will be retained or shared, transferring materials between institutions, and any insurance or liability issues or costs associated with using facilities at another institution. All of these agreements are not necessarily solely focused on collaborative projects, so you may also run into these types of agreements in non-collaborative research. Later on, I'll show you some specific examples of collaborative documentation on the Open Science Framework. Another aspect of good documentation is having a clear organizational structure for your project. On our computers, we typically organize things using folders. If you have subfolders in a folder, you're already organizing things hierarchically. Organizing your files and folders hierarchically makes it easier to find things, especially if you and your collaborators agree on a standard. To organize research data, we recommend having one folder per project and subfolders for distinct aspects of that project. For example, you could have folders for data, notes, protocols, and manuscripts. Then within manuscripts, you could have folders for each paper and then sections of that paper. No matter how you organize it, you should agree on a standard format within your research group and with your collaborators to make your data interoperable. Since you'll be sharing files among various individuals, it's also important to develop a file naming convention early, so you don't end up with files that look like this. For file naming, the most important thing is that the names you use are descriptive and applied consistently. You want to avoid using overly generic file names like paper or project. You also want to avoid having overly long file names. At the beginning of a project, think critically about folder and file organization and how to best develop a convention that will facilitate that. It's good to document this convention for yourself, but especially important if you're working on a team to make sure the convention is understood and others can follow it. Think about what can be added and what can be omitted in your file names. If you're the only person on a project, you probably don't need to include your name. Are there different descriptive aspects of your project, such as location, date or time, or particular material? You can add that element to the name. Could you end up generating multiple versions of a file as you test various hypotheses and analyses? For those, you would want to add a version number or date to differentiate. Some common elements that file names may include are project acronyms, location, investigator, date of data collection, data type, and version number. When thinking about how to organize your data, ask yourself, what kinds of files do I have? It's a good idea to go back to the data inventory you created when writing your data management plan because it describes the type of data you're going to collect and lists any other research outputs. How can I group these things? Of these attributes, what are the most important ones? You'll base your folder structure on the answers to these questions. Here's an example of some research materials that need to be organized. Take a few minutes to look at these files and think about what problems you see in the file names, and think about how you might organize these files into subfolders to make them easier to find later. So now I'm going to boil down what I think are the 3 big takeaways for effective collaboration, and in some ways completely oversimplify a complex and challenging endeavor. But if you document all the things, really get organized, and communicate often and openly, a project will be better equipped to overcome some of the challenges I described. There are various web-based tools that make collaboration easier across all the stages of the research lifecycle. I'm going to highlight just a few of these to give you a sense of what's available before we examine the Open Science Framework in more depth. Please note that the tools I'm highlighting tend to be those that are already fairly widely adopted, but new tools are created all the time to meet specific information management needs. For reference management, there are multiple options that people can choose from. Some are institutionally sponsored, such as EndNote, but others are freely available, like Mendeley and Zotero. Mendeley, EndNote, and Zotero all have desktop and online versions of their software. All of these products allow you to collect and manage a citation library. In some, you can also upload full text documents in addition to citations, though storage can be limited. Many library databases allow for direct export to EndNote or to an XML, BibTeX, or RIS file. These formats can be uploaded and read into any reference management product. Zotero also has a browser plugin that will allow you to pull citation information from web pages, although it doesn't work perfectly. You can also use some of these tools to generate a bibliography in various citation style formats. EndNote has a huge library of citation styles. Mendeley and Zotero have more of a social media focus in that you can set up an online profile so that others can find and follow you. You can in turn follow others with similar interests. For collaboration, all of these tools will allow you to share your citations and document libraries with others. The way sharing happens differs based on the tool. The commercial products, RefWorks and EndNote, will allow you to create a shared folder or library with specific access, editing, and download privileges. They also allow for the creation of group accounts where all members can work collaboratively to build a reference library. Mendeley and Zotero allow you to create groups where others can collaborate on building a reference and document library. You can set your group to either public, semi-public, which means anyone can view but only approved members can post, or completely private, which means membership is closed and no one can see your bibliography. Moving on to tools that will allow for collaborative file storage and sharing, as you can see, there are many out there. I'm sure most, if not all of you, have already taken advantage of the collaborative document editing and sharing that can be done through Google Drive. Other products, such as OneDrive, Amazon Web Services, and Dropbox, are cloud-based storage, and depending on what you're willing to pay, can offer unlimited storage capacity. CSU provides researchers 1 terabyte on Microsoft OneDrive and allows the use of other systems like Dropbox and Google Drive. Academic Computing and Networking Services also provide storage for a fee on RStore, a storage management system that college IT administrators can set up for researchers in their departments. GitHub and Bitbucket are primarily for those who want to share programming code. While both were established primarily for those developing software, you can use them to share any type of building block code, such as statistical programming statements. There are several things you should consider when you're choosing a tool for file storage and sharing. Depending on what you need, it's never a bad idea to check online for a comparison matrix. You can also ask your peers and see what they have experience with using. I already mentioned the importance of having a plan for managing the various versions of files that will be produced during collaborative research projects. A plan for version control can be as simple as a manual process where you append a version number onto the end of your file names. Or you can use a date, which will keep all your files ordered nicely within your file structure. But another option that might be preferable, especially if you're going to be working on more complex files, is a version control system. There are various version control systems out there, and some tools like Google Drive and the Open Science Framework have built-in versioning functionalities. Some of these programs are more commonly used in software development communities, but the functionality can apply to various collaborative workflows. Even though there can be somewhat of a learning curve with some of these programs, they can help to avoid some common pitfalls that can come about from using manual version control. I won't say too much more about version control systems right now, since there's a whole workshop about version control using Get that's been offered at the library in the past. To look at these materials, go to the link on the slide. Another type of documentation that researchers have used within labs for a long time to document their hypotheses, experiments, procedures, and analyses are lab notebooks. Today we're seeing electronic lab notebook programs that can facilitate the recording of the same type of information that was previously found in paper lab notebooks, but allows the information to be more easily organized and shared with other lab team members or partners across institutions. There are also notebooks such as Jupyter Notebook that are more focused on instruction of coding and literate programming practices, where researchers can input code and use the notebook for performing data cleaning, statistical modeling, and visualizing data. ELNs vary in their cost models, functionality, and which disciplines they favor, but here are a few of what seem to be the more popular options that I've seen. Recently, librarians at Harvard created a comparison matrix of 25 ELNs with information about features related to interactivity, support for research or documentation, adaptability to different workflows, storage, and security. RStudio also has a built-in notebook functionality that you can learn more about at the link to past workshop materials. When you get to the point of writing up your results for publication, it can be helpful to use a co-authoring tool to streamline the editing process without having to send email attachments back and forth or create multiple drafts that can become difficult to manage. For simple documents with minimal privacy concerns, Google Docs can provide an adequate solution. Overleaf and DoDoc provide additional functionality, and Share LaTeX is useful if you need the technical formatting that LaTeX provides. Note that Share LaTeX and Overleaf are actually in the process of merging. Authoria is a fairly recent tool that offers a combination of file management, co-authoring, and preprint service for different styles of documents, from traditional research papers to LaTeX documents to interactive visualizations and even markdown documents with code blocks like electronic notebooks. When it comes to sharing your data, there are a lot of different repositories out there. This is a very heterogeneous and constantly changing landscape. Perhaps you've heard of or used one of these repositories before for finding data. Repositories can be hosted by a particular funding agency, could have been built to support data generated in a particular discipline, developed to serve as a home for data generated by researchers at a particular institution, and some countries, such as Australia and the United Kingdom, have their own national data archives. Other repositories exist to take in any kind of data that researchers wish to preserve and provide access to. In December, I'll be offering a whole workshop on choosing a repository for your data, so going into depth on this is beyond the scope of what I want to do here. However, I'll say that in the context of collaborative workflows, it can be helpful to consider tools and practices that make it easy to move your data into an archive at the end of a project. For instance, the Open Science Framework, which I'll be turning to next, offers integrations with Dataverse and Figshare. So now we're going to focus on one collaboration tool in particular. The Open Science Framework is a free open source service of the Center for Open Science that was created as a public good to aid research. It's a rare tool that is useful in pretty much every part of the research data lifecycle. It also either currently integrates with or aspires to integrate with many of the tools we've mentioned so far, with the goal of serving as a comprehensive research management tool. For the rest of the workshop, I'll be discussing 6 collaboration topics and features of the Open Science Framework that assist with these practices. You can store descriptive information about your project in the Wiki. You can organize your research hierarchically using components. You can store your data on OSF storage or attach cloud drives as add-ons. You can allow collaborators that have OSF accounts access to your projects using the contributor feature. You can keep track of revisions using the built-in version control. And finally, you can communicate with collaborators using the Wiki or the built-in commenting system. We're going to walk through an exercise using example files that were developed by the Center for Open Science to illustrate some of the collaborative features of the OSF. First, go to this link and download the example files. You can download all the files at once in the zipped folder called Example Materials, and then extract the files on your computer. After you've done that, we're going to get started by creating an OSF account. To create an OSF account, go to osf.io and click Sign Up in the upper right. Then fill in your name, email, and a password. Check your inbox for a confirmation email from the OSF and verify your email address. In the example materials, ANES stands for the American National Election Survey. This example was chosen to be fairly easy to understand regardless of your academic background. Open up the questionnaire file. It's a small subset of the actual survey, plus one made-up question. Look at the questionnaire and develop a research question for your study. It doesn't have to be complex. For example, you can examine the relationship between 2 variables, and you won't need to analyze this. Once you're logged into the OSF, you should see a dashboard page. Click the green button that says Create a New Project above the search box on the right. Choose a name for your project that communicates something about the research question you just developed. Enter your project's name and hit Create. Let's go over the general layout of an Open Science Framework project. You've got your title at the top, in this case, Workshop Exercise, Political Identity and Income Inequality. You've got other information like when it was created and a place to put a brief description. Additionally, you have the Wiki panel where you can describe your project in more detail, a Files panel where you can view associated files, and a Components panel where you can see what components are part of your project. Let's start with the Wiki. This is a good place to present a broad overview of your project. It's meant to evolve over the course of the project, so you can also add things like where you are in the course of the project and what your near-term goals are. As you collect data, it's also useful to put things like variable and ID definitions in this section. To access the Wiki, either click on the Wiki panel or the Wiki menu item at the top. To add content, click the Edit button in the upper right. You can use the tools above the right panel to add formatting. The Wiki is written in Markdown language, so if you want to see the formatted text, look in the middle panel. When you're done, hit Save in the lower right. Try adding some content to your wiki, formatting it as you see fit. Here's an example of the type of information you might want to include about your study. Earlier, I talked about the importance of keeping your files organized in folders. Components are essentially sub-projects or subfolders of your OSF project. Each component has separate privacy settings, wiki, add-ons, and files. Here are some examples of how to separate your content into components. Let's look at some examples. In this first example, the project is for the McDougall Lab. The components are for projects within that lab, like a barcoding project and an insect food web project, and a project about the effect of chocolate on grad student happiness. If we click on the barcoding project, we can see that there are subcomponents for photos, lab notebooks, and data collection sheets. The insect food web project has components for identification keys and field samples. This next example is for a clinical research project. Thus, the components are for standard parts of a clinical trial, such as clinical protocol, consent forms, IRB forms, and analysis. Notice that there's no data component because of privacy concerns, and none of these components have subcomponents. This example is a project associated with a manuscript. You can see that a link in the wiki takes you to the full manuscript within the OSF. Each component represents a manuscript section, like analysis, script and output, data, tables, and figures. This last example is a project for a large collaborative effort by many contributors to replicate psychological research. The components are fairly eclectic, with sections for analysis, resources, presentations, comments, and papers that they are trying to replicate. Each of these study components has subcomponents for a final report, data, study materials, and analysis audit. Let's think about how we would organize our exercise files into components. Here are the files we're working with. And here is one organizational structure you might choose to organize these files. Let's add components based on the organizational structure we've chosen. To add a new component, I'll click on Add Component in the Components panel. Then OSF will ask for a title, in this case Data. It asks you whether you'd like to add contributors, but we'll get to contributors later. When you've named your component, click Create and then go to New Component. Now you have a new component called Data. The layout of the component page looks similar to that of the entire project because all components have separate wikis, files, and can have their own components. Now let's add the data file to this component using the Files pane. To add files to the OSF, first select the storage space you want to add files to. Since we haven't linked any add-ons yet, the only choice you have right now is OSF storage. This action will make an Upload button appear. Once you click this button, you can choose which files to add. Alternatively, you can drag and drop files into the Files pane. Try creating the following components and uploading the example files to their respective components. The OSF also integrates with many of the collaboration tools that researchers already use. Here is a list of the current add-ons. So in addition to the built-in OSF storage, you can also use storage add-ons, which include many cloud services you might already be using. I'll show you how to use storage add-ons with Google Drive as an example. To connect an add-on service, select Add-ons from the menu bar. Then click Enable next to the add-on that you want, in this case Google Drive. Then OSF will ask you to confirm that you want to connect this add-on given the conditions stated above. Agreeing to the terms will add Google Drive as an add-on and allow you to import your account. After you import your account, OSF will ask you to pick a folder to associate with the component you want. You might want to plan ahead to match the folder structure in Google Drive with the structure of your components. For example, I've created a data subfolder, and all of the files in that folder will be linked to my data component. After you save this choice, you should be able to see your Google Drive in the Files pane. If you change your mind about how things are organized, don't worry. You can reconfigure your add-ons by going into Settings and selecting Configure Add-ons from the left panel. Now try this for yourself. First, go to the data component. Then make a folder in your Google Drive or other supported cloud service. Next, add the example data file to this folder. Then follow the instructions to link your Google Drive to OSF. Finally, confirm that the new folder is in the data component files. If you don't feel comfortable linking your Google Drive, you can use this time to practice adding subcomponents. Now that we have some data loaded, let's look at how to add collaborators to our project using the Contributors feature. A contributor can be anyone with an OSF account. When you add a contributor, you can control what parts of your project they can see. Additionally, you can decide whether they can read content only, change content, or administer content, which gives them the rights to make components and add other contributors. You can have different sets of contributors for every component. To add a contributor, click on Contributors on the menu bar, then click the green box that says Add to the right of the Contributors heading. Note that you can also control who is a bibliographic contributor. This means that they will be included in the citation that OSF generates. You can also share a view-only link with someone. OSF will then create a search box where you can search for collaborators that have OSF accounts. Click the green plus sign next to your collaborator's name, then pick what type of access you'd like to grant them. Finally, pick what components you'd like them to have access to. At this point, you should see your collaborator's name in the Contributors tab and on the main page of your project. If you can, find someone to add as a contributor to your project and play with the access settings to prove to yourself that they work. The next feature I'm going to talk about is version control. Have you ever gotten horribly confused about what the latest version of your document is after emailing things back and forth with collaborators? If so, you'll love OSF's version control feature. OSF's version control feature tracks who did what when, and also interfaces nicely with more complex version control systems like Git and GitHub. Every time you make a change to a file in OSF, the version control feature archives a hidden instance of the previous version called a revision, but you only see one file in your directory. Let's see how this works. To demonstrate, I'm going to edit one of the analysis scripts in the OSF. If I click on the file name, the contents of the text file appear in a new window. Then I can edit the file by clicking Edit above where the file is displayed. This opens an editing window. Does it look familiar? It's the same editing window as the Wiki. This editor is available for all text-based files in the OSF. I'm going to make a change here, then click Save. Now that the changes are saved, I can click on the Revisions button above the file. This opens a new pane where I can see that I have 2 revisions with the newest version on top. If I want to look at an old revision, I can download it by hitting the blue button to the right of the username. You can revert to older versions of a file if a mistake is made. To revert to an older version, download a revision file by pressing the blue box with the downward arrow. Then rename the file to the same name as the current version. Finally, drag and drop the file you just downloaded into the same folder as the file you want to revert. This will create a new revision. You can also revise non-text files using this strategy. The final communication feature I want to mention today is commenting. You can communicate with your contributors by commenting directly in the OSF. This will send them an email notification, and they can then reply in the OSF. And all your work can be made public at the push of a button. You can control which parts are public at the component level. OSF will generate a persistent link to your project and generate a recommended citation. You can also assign a license to your project, such as a Creative Commons license. Once you make your project public, you can also track views and downloads. To sum up, documentation is key, there are lots of tools out there, and it's best to do what works for your team. Here's a list of references. And thanks for listening. I hope you found this information to be helpful. Please email me at the address on this slide if you need help. Also, check out our data management pages for more information.